This is a presentation to support community engagement on the city's interim final Pakington Street and Gordon Avenue Urban Design Framework, or UDF. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people as the traditional owners of this land and all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are part of the Greater Geelong community today. This presentation will cover the following: the role of a UDF and what it can and cannot do, including an outline of the process we're following to prepare a final UDF for council adoption and where we're up to in that process. How we have engaged the community throughout preparing the UDF, in order to discuss what the community told us about the draft UDF, and how we responded by preparing changes to the interim final UDF. Finally, it will address what happens next and how you can contribute to this project. A UDF sets the direction for the future of an area and is a long-term visioning document that sets built form controls to guide development outcomes and recommends improvements to the public realm. This UDF is a design-led approach to deliver on other council policies, including the settlement strategy, retail strategy, urban forest strategy, and the social housing plan, to name a few. However, a UDF does not determine where and what developments occur, as this is dependent on individual interest and investment by private landowners and developers. All future development proposals are subject to the planning scheme, which offers opportunities for objections to be raised by the community. Since every proposal in the UDF is subject to further work and further community engagement, the UDF cannot determine final outcomes. This timeline shows the process we are following in order to prepare a final UDF for Council to consider for adoption. It highlights the different stages that have and will involve community engagement. As you can see, these stages come before key milestones in preparing versions of the UDF itself. This allows us to use the information we receive during consultation as a key guide for recommendations, projects, and guidelines proposed as we develop the UDF. We are currently completing Stage 7 and undergoing engagement on the interim final UDF in order to review, make changes, and prepare a final UDF to be considered for council adoption in late November 2021. Now, I'll provide an overview of how we have engaged the community in past stages of the project and a summary of the activities that were involved. The first phase of community engagement was geared towards understanding what was working and not working well, opportunities or ideas for possible projects and improvements, and establishing a future vision for the area. In this first phase, there was an initial 6-week engagement period that took place from February to March in 2018 and included an online survey and various face-to-face community workshops, noting this took place before the COVID-19 pandemic. In order to spread the word in the community to participate, the city organized social media posts, an article in the city's community update, newspaper ads, a 3,000-letter mail-out to owners and occupiers in the area, and attended Paco Festa to distribute flyers. Further engagement was also undertaken in December 2018 when a consultant collected face-to-face surveys for each street block along Pakington Street. In April 2019, when the city held a trader workshop in the Geelong West Library, and May 2019, when care factor surveys were collected for Geelong West. A total of 910 submissions and participants formed part of this first phase across all activities, which helped to inform preparation of the draft UDF. The second phase of community engagement was geared towards gaining community feedback on the recommendations and proposals in the draft UDF. Consultation on the draft UDF took place for an extended 24-week period, throughout which the city organized and ran a series of engagement activities, including online community meetings and one-on-one phone or online interviews, produced a summary brochure for distribution, and published a frequently asked questions resource in the Have Your Say page to encourage participation and review of the document. The city organized a media release, social media posts, an article in the city's community update, newspaper ads, and 2 3,000-letter mailouts to owners and occupiers in the area to spread the word in the community about the release of the draft UDF. There was sustained communication and meetings with the Geelong West Traders Association from April to October 2020. A total of 77 submissions and 51 participants formed part of the second phase, which helped to inform changes and review of the draft UDF in order to prepare the interim final. The third phase of community engagement, which is where we currently are, is geared towards getting community feedback on the updated recommendations and projects in the interim final UDF. This third phase of engagement is not typically part of the normal consultation process, but was proposed to account for the impacts of COVID and provide community members and other key stakeholders with another opportunity to provide feedback. The Projects Have Your Say page went live and started accepting submissions on the 6th of August. That same day, we published social media posts and sent out an email update to the project's Keep Informed list. The city organized a mail out to 3,000 local owners and occupiers on the 11th of August and included an ad in the city news section of the Times, Indy, and Geelong Advertiser newspapers published on the 19th, 20th, and 21st of August. The interim final UDF and summary brochure can be viewed online and downloaded. Note that you can also request a printed copy by contacting city offices. Next, we will discuss the key issues that emerged from consultation on the draft UDF. This slide presents the key topics that were discussed and commented on in feedback received on the draft UDF. As you can see, a large majority of overall comments relate to buildings and development, followed by movement and access. Within the topic of buildings and development, there was an overarching preference for buildings up to 6 stories and general support for more mixed-use developments that could improve the look of the Pakington North and Gordon Avenue precincts. There was an overall concern with allowing anything over 4 stories near existing heritage areas and addressing how taller buildings would impact surrounding residential properties. Within the topic of movement and access, there was overarching support to make the streets more green, walkable, and pedestrian-friendly for everyone, which included addressing tripping hazards on existing footpaths. There was an overall concern with how having more local residents in the area would impact traffic and competition for public parking. If you would like further information on the findings of community consultation on the draft UDF, the Community Engagement Report Summary and supporting documents can be downloaded from the links section on the bottom of the Have Your Say page. This next section of the presentation will highlight how we have addressed concerns from the draft UDF in producing the interim final. In order to respond to consultation feedback, the interim final UDF makes the following key changes to proposed heights. Along a transition of 4-story heights from the Heritage Core Precinct and adjacent to low-rise residential areas within a heritage overlay. Further refines heights within the rail yard site with a mix of 6, 8, and 10 stories, with the tallest heights located near the center of the site along the interface with the rail line. Lower heights up to 4 and 6 stories around the Church Street intersection to provide a better height transition to lower rise surrounding residential areas. Taller 8-story heights along the interface with the rail line, and inclusion of further controls for the existing Woolworths or Strand site, which will be specifically addressed in the next slide. These changes present an overall reduction in the predominant heights in the precinct in response to consultation feedback. A reduction in heights and additional interface and setback controls aim to minimize impacts of overshadowing and overlooking, which will be discussed further in the presentation. It's important to remember that while the UDF provides built-form controls and objectives to guide future development outcomes, it does not determine what developments will occur or when they occur, as this is dependent on individual interest and investment by private landowners and developers. All future development proposals are subject to the planning scheme, offering opportunities for objections to be raised by the community. Note that no changes in height are proposed within the Heritage Core Precinct in order to continue to protect the existing heritage buildings and low-scale character of the area. In the period between completing consultation on the draft UDF and preparing the interim final, it was discovered that no height limits are in place for the Woolworths site in the current planning scheme. Given this is a large site that is already in a mixed-use zone, the new introduced height limits and controls aim to guide any future redevelopment of the site in order to reduce the risk of overdevelopment and provide further protection for the area. A range of height limits of 4 to 8 stories are proposed, as well as new public open space adjacent to Waterton Street directly opposite Ashby Primary School. There are also other controls such as site coverage of a maximum 60% and setback controls which provide additional separation between adjacent properties and any future development to ensure impacts on residential and commercial areas are minimized. In this sense, the UDF proposes controls to be put in place to manage any future development on the site, and is not proposing a specific development outcome. The development of the site will be dependent on the current or future landowners lodging a planning application, which will then be considered in more detail and will be subject to the planning scheme. In response to consultation feedback, the interim final UDF makes the following key changes to proposed heights in the Gordon Avenue precinct. further refines heights along Gordon Avenue, giving a more consistent 4- and 6-story outcome. Lower heights up to 4 stories to provide a better height transition to lower rise surrounding residential areas. Taller 8- and 10-story heights along the interface with Latrobe Terrace and the existing Geelong Station car park to provide a height transition with the station precinct in central Geelong. These changes present an overall reduction in the predominant heights in the precinct in response to consultation feedback. A reduction in heights and additional interface and setback controls aim to minimize impacts of overshadowing and overlooking, both of which will be discussed during this presentation. It's important to remember that while the UDF provides built form controls and objectives, it does not determine what developments will occur or when they occur, as this is dependent on individual interest and investment by private landowners and developers. All future development proposals are also subject to the planning scheme, which offers opportunities for objections to be raised by the community. The interim final proposes to undertake an infrastructure capacity assessment for the area as a whole in response to proposed intensification, which will inform an appropriate mechanism for development contributions to deliver required infrastructure upgrades. This work will need to be completed prior to or concurrently with a planning scheme amendment to incorporate the UDF, which can take anywhere from 1 to 3 years and includes further community consultation. In response to consultation feedback relating to minimizing the impact of taller buildings, the interim final introduces site coverage and solar access controls in both the Pakington North and Gordon Avenue precincts. Site coverage relates to the amount of space within the site that can be taken up by buildings, which allows for more space to be used for other elements like landscaping. These introduced controls respond to the different characteristics and context of the site as follows. The highest level of site coverage at 80% is proposed where there are smaller sites that directly adjoin with lower scale residential areas, so that landscaping can be delivered along these interfaces. It is also proposed along the front of sites along Latrobe Terrace to improve amenity of the street. A moderate site coverage at 70% is proposed where there are larger sites that also directly adjoin with lower scale residential areas so that landscaping can be delivered along these interfaces, but also provide opportunities for internal courtyards that will help improve amenity for future residents. The lowest site coverage at 60% is proposed for 2 large sites in the Pakington North Precinct, which should provide open spaces for both public and private use to improve amenity and access to open space. This site coverage is proposed for larger sites closest to Pakington Street and within an established residential area to ensure future developments are required to deliver sufficient amenity within development for the use of future residents. The interim final proposes solar access controls to protect the public realm, including Pakington Street and Ashby Primary School in the Pakington North Precinct, and Autumn Street, Gordon Avenue, and Spring Street in the Gordon Avenue Precinct. Solar access relating to private properties is currently managed through existing controls in the planning scheme that will be used to assess all future developments through the planning application process. In order to respond to concerns raised during consultation regarding the impact of taller buildings on surrounding residents, the interim final proposes a series of treatments to address and manage the different surrounding conditions future developments will need to address. This slide shows sections for how different residential interfaces are proposed to be managed. These sections show future buildings will be required to set back or step back any additional stories above the first 2, as well as adding separation between the side or rear of existing dwellings and future developments, which will be required to be planted and landscaped in order to soften height transition and the look of future developments. This separation between existing residential properties and taller elements of future developments also addresses overlooking and solar access, and are additional to controls already in place in the planning scheme. These are a few of the built form controls proposed in the interim final that also aim to improve future development outcomes and address amenity impacts to surrounding residential areas. They include designing buildings that are sensitive to the context by setting back upper building levels that are designed to minimize impact and visibility when viewed from the street. Delivering high amenity housing that minimizes overlooking by ensuring internal privacy is well managed through building separation, landscaping, and the careful location of windows. Integrate landscaping as a key driver of building design by providing rear and side landscape setbacks where new developments are directly adjacent to existing residential properties and better manage height transitions. Improving the public realm and retaining the village character of the area by providing landscape setbacks along the front of traffic streets like Latrobe Terrace and Gordon Avenue. The combination of proposed heights, site coverage, interface or setback controls, and built form objectives proposed in the interim final come together to minimize impacts to solar access and overlooking for surrounding existing residents. A transport network assessment and parking precinct plan are underway to inform road infrastructure upgrades, treatments, and mechanisms to manage traffic and parking impacts over time as the two precincts develop, in order to respond to concerns raised regarding movement and access. New laneway connections and pedestrian links are proposed in the interim final to improve the accessibility and walkability of the area. It also recommends undertaking an infrastructure assessment and setting a contributions mechanism in place prior to or concurrently with a planning scheme amendment to rezone the land in both precincts in order to address how these upgrades and additional treatments can be delivered. Providing private car parking for future developments is a requirement that is managed through the planning scheme during the planning application process, where individual applications or proposals will need to demonstrate that the traffic they would generate can be accommodated on the local road network. In order to respond to the vision of providing greener precincts and concerns raised during consultation on the draft UDF regarding impacts to access to open space, the interim final proposes the following: public open space in the rail yard site, the Woolworth site, and in a council-owned car park in the Gordon Avenue precinct. Acknowledging that the two proposed sites in the Pakington North precinct rely on redevelopment of privately owned sites, the interim final recommends a further review of public open space provision as part of the infrastructure capacity assessment in order to explore other mechanisms and locations through the planning process. There are existing controls in the planning scheme that guide the provision of private open space for future residents to have access to within future developments. Street tree canopy will also be considered and enhanced through the master planning process for Pakington Street and Gordon Avenue, which will commence after the endorsement of the final urban design framework. The interim final includes visualizations or artistic representations of what the future of the Pakington North and Gordon Avenue precincts could be, to give an idea about the type and look of future buildings, along with landscaping and street tree improvements. These images are indicative and do not represent the actual future outcome for the area. The top image is looking north along Pakington Street near the intersection with Church Street, where an 8-story height limit is currently proposed. The visualization shows buildings of that scale that provide active retail and commercial uses on the street, with recessed upper levels offering apartment living opportunities. The image also addresses further greening and proposed raised pedestrian crossings. The bottom image is looking east along Gordon Avenue toward the intersection with Latrobe Terrace and the existing Geelong train station car park, where a 6-story height limit is proposed. The visualization shows buildings of that scale that provide different residential opportunities and addresses further greening. The interim final UDF proposes height limits and additional urban design controls to protect the current character of the area and its heritage values, while introducing a new character for the Pakington North and Gordon Avenue precincts, which past community consultation highlighted were in need of renewal and improvement. Through ensuring tallest buildings are proposed along Latrobe Terrace or the rail interface and allowing for a gradual transition to lower heights where they approach existing low-rise residential areas and the heritage core. Future landscaping and additional open space will also enhance the character and village feel of the Pakington North and Gordon Avenue precincts. Overall, the scale of development proposed in both precincts responds to changing economic conditions, requirements for urban consolidation in the city's settlement strategy, and the development needs for these areas as set out in the city's retail strategy. Now, let's discuss what happens next. This phase of community engagement on the interim final will finish after a 6-week period at close of business on Friday the 17th of September. We will then review and collate submissions received in order to produce the final UDF from mid-September to October. The final UDF is scheduled to be considered for council adoption on the 23rd of November council meeting. If the final UDF is endorsed by council, further work included in the implementation section will begin and some of the key projects will be completed by mid-2022, with the planning scheme amendment to incorporate the UDF into the planning scheme likely to commence in late 2022. You can provide feedback on the interim final by making a submission through the Projects Have Your Say page, or if you wish to speak to an officer, please contact us on 03 5272 5078. You can contact the Urban Design and Heritage team through the Urban Design and Heritage email or by writing to us at Wadawurrung Country, P.O. Box 104. We look forward to your feedback. Thank you.